This was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Instead, a stranger stood in the shadows of Rosewood Manor, dressed in a gown 3 years too old, telling her to run. The housekeeper had sworn no one else lived in this wing, and yet here she was, close enough that Grace could see the dust on her sleeves and something close to fear in her eyes. 3 years? Grace asked. Since what? Since my wedding night, the woman said quietly. The same night you are about to have. Somewhere below them, a door opened. Footsteps started up the stairs, unhurried, patient, the footsteps of someone who had never once needed to rush inside this house. Go, the woman whispered, before she finds us both. Grace didn't move. Every question she had swallowed over the last 3 months rose up at once. Who was this woman? Why was she still here, hidden inside a house everyone believed she had left? And who exactly was climbing those stairs? Those answers would have to wait, because none of this made any sense yet, not without going back to where it actually started. 3 months earlier, Grace didn't know Rosewood Manor existed beyond gossip at the market. She didn't know the name Sarah. She didn't know that a warm, soft-spoken housekeeper named Comfort would one day matter more to her in life than almost anyone else in Palmgate. 3 months earlier, Grace knew only one thing for certain. Her mother's hospital bills were due soon, her sewing machine jammed twice a day, and her younger brother needed school shoes she couldn't yet afford. Dreaming about mansions on the hill was a luxury she had given up years ago. Everyone else in Palmgate dreamt about it for her. They called him Rosewood Michael. He didn't need a surname. The mansion on the hill said enough on its own. Marble floors, a gate with 2 guards, a car for every day of the week. Women whispered about him at the salon, at the market, even during Sunday announcements when the pastor wasn't looking. Grace never joined those conversations. She had a business to run and no room in her life for a man whose name alone could stop conversations. 2 weeks later, she wasn't laughing anymore. She was sitting across from Michael at a small restaurant, listening to him talk about his late uncle, the man who built Rosewood Manor and left it to him. There was a weight in his voice whenever the house came up, a weight he never quite explained. Why me? Grace finally asked. You could have any woman in this town. Any woman who wants the house, Michael said. You are the first person who argued with me about fabric prices instead of asking to see my car. It should have felt romantic. Instead, something in that answer stayed with her longer than it should have. A few nights later, Grace sat by her mother's bed the way she did most evenings, folding laundry while her mother dozed. When she mentioned, almost in passing, that Michael had asked her to dinner again, her mother's eyes opened at once, sharp and curious. The Rosewood one? Her mother asked. Grace, be careful with a man like that. Big houses don't always mean big hearts. It's just dinner, Mama. It's never just dinner, her mother said, and closed her eyes again, as if she had already said more than she meant to. Grace laughed it off that night too. She was getting good at laughing things off. At their next dinner, he said something he clearly hadn't turned to say. My father built that mansion to prove something to people who never respected him, he told her, staring at his hands instead of her face. I've spent years trying to fill a house that was never really about family. Maybe you don't have to keep fighting his argument, Grace said gently. Maybe not, Michael answered. But old houses carry old debts, whether the new owner asked for them or not. He said it like a joke. Grace would remember months later that it wasn't one. For now, though, she only knew this. A man the whole town had turned into a legend was admitting things he apparently told no one else. And whatever Rosewood Manor was hiding behind its marble floors, it was about to become her problem too, whether she was ready for it or not. If this slow-burning tension is already pulling you in, hit like and subscribe to help us grow. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Now, back to the story. Weeks passed and Michael kept showing up at the shop. His sister's order had long since been finished and delivered, but somehow he always found a fresh reason to return.
a button that needed resewing, a color he wanted her opinion on, an errand that could easily have waited. Grace pretended not to notice how often those reasons appeared, and pretended even harder that she didn't look forward to them. Then one Tuesday morning, she sat in the hospital corridor beside her mother, dreading the conversation she knew was coming about the balance still owed. A nurse called her name and handed her a slim receipt instead of a bill. "It's already settled," the nurse said, glancing at her clipboard. "Paid in full yesterday afternoon." Grace read the paper twice, certain there had been a mistake. There hadn't been. She found Michael outside her shop that same afternoon and didn't bother with a greeting. "I don't want your money," she said, arms crossed, more confused than angry. "I didn't give it for thanks," Michael answered, calm despite the fire in her voice. "I gave it because you needed it and I could help, that's all." People don't just help like that, not for strangers. "Maybe you stopped being a stranger somewhere around the fabric argument," he said, and for once he wasn't joking. It was the kind of answer that made warnings sound smaller than they actually were. And there were warnings. Grace heard the first one 2 days later, pulled aside outside the church after Sunday service. The woman's grip tightened around her wrist as though she meant to hold Grace in place by force. Around them, other women lingered a little too long by the gate, pretending to arrange their headscarves while they listened. "That man has buried 3 fiancés in gossip, if not in the ground," the woman said. "Where did they go? Nobody knows. One day they are showing rings, the next day gone. No wedding, no goodbye, nothing." "Maybe they just left him," Grace said, more defensive than she meant to sound. "Maybe. Or maybe that house doesn't let women leave the way they came in." Grace walked home turning the words over, telling herself church women loved a dramatic story more than they loved the truth. That night, she almost mentioned it to Deborah, then decided against it, certain her friend would only tease her about being scared of gossip. But over the following days, she noticed this wasn't only a church woman's story. It followed her to the market in half-finished sentences that stopped the moment she got close. It followed her into conversations she hadn't started. Everyone in Palmgate, it seemed, carried their own version of the same warning, and every version circled back to the same unanswered question. Where had those women actually gone? Grace didn't know yet that answering that question would cost her 3 months, 1 wedding, and a night she would never fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it themselves. For now, she folded the warning away the same way she folded finished fabric, neatly, out of sight, telling herself there would be time later to unpack it properly. She had a shop to run, a mother to nurse back to health, and a man who kept finding new reasons to make both of those things easier. Whatever debts the church women kept whispering about, it belonged for now to someone else's story. An old man selling roasted corn near the church added his own version days later, the kind of tale traded in half-whispers between customers waiting on their order. He never looked up from the coals while he spoke, as though watching the fire made the words easier to say out loud. "That land was cursed long before that boy's mansion was built," he said, turning the corn slowly. "His father took what wasn't his to take, and some debts don't stay buried. They wait, they collect interest." "And who's supposed to be collecting it?" Grace asked, half amused, half unsettled. The old man only shrugged and handed her the corn without answering. Grace didn't believe in curses, but she noticed that everyone in Palmgate, believer or not, kept circling back to the same idea, a debt that was never repaid, waiting patiently to be collected by someone, somewhere, sooner or later. She mentioned it to Deborah that evening, expecting her to laugh it off like she usually did. Deborah didn't laugh this time. "I heard the same thing from my Aunt Taylor," Deborah said, suddenly serious, setting down the fabric she had been folding. 3 women, all engaged to him, all disappeared before the wedding or right after. As for the last one, her family filed a police report, then withdrew it a week later and moved to another town. Nobody explains why. So why hasn't anyone stopped him? Because he has money, Grace, and money makes people forget to ask questions.
Grace carried that thought with her the next time she visited Rosewood Manor properly, walking its marble corridors for the first time as something closer to family than a guest. It was Comfort, the housekeeper who had raised Michael since before he could walk, who delivered the next warning, so gently it barely sounded like one. "You're the fourth one," Comfort said, stirring a pot without looking up from the stove. "The fourth what?" "Fiancé. I've dressed 3 brides in this house. None of them stayed past their wedding night." "Where did they go?" "Away from what they found here. That's all I'll say. Ask Michael if you have the courage." Grace did ask him that same night, standing in the doorway of his study, while he sorted through papers he suddenly seemed very interested in. She watched his jaw tighten in a way she hadn't seen before. "They left because they wanted money more than they wanted me," Michael said, not looking up. "I don't like to talk about it. Please don't ask again." It wasn't an answer, it was a door closing, and Grace was starting to notice how many doors in this story kept closing the moment she got close to them. That night, lying awake above her own shop, long after the street outside had gone quiet, Grace made herself a quiet promise. If nobody else in Palmgate had the courage to ask the right questions out loud, she would find her own way to ask them. She would do it carefully, in her own time, without giving anyone a reason to shut another door in her face. Deborah wasn't willing to let the questions go as easily as Grace seemed to be. While Grace filled orders and answered congratulations she wasn't sure she felt yet, Deborah spent her free afternoons at the market. She asked questions nobody else dared to ask out loud, chasing down every thread the corn seller and the church aunt had left dangling. She started with the salon, then the seamstresses 2 stalls down, then anyone who had ever set foot inside Rosewood Manor and lived to describe it. She found a young woman who had worked 2 months as a maid at Rosewood Manor before quitting without explanation, tracked down through a cousin who worked at the salon. "I didn't leave because of Michael," the woman told Deborah, glancing over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might report her. "I left because of the room at the end of the east hallway. Comfort called it storage. Storage doesn't need 3 locks, and storage doesn't need feeding." "Feeding?" Deborah asked, already regretting the question. "I saw the housekeeper carry a tray in there twice a day, every day for 2 months. When I finally asked what was inside, she told me it wasn't my business to keep, and neither was my job if I wanted to keep asking questions. I packed my bag that same night, and I haven't slept well since, if I'm honest with you." Deborah tried to repeat all of this to Grace that same evening, catching her between fittings with pins still in her lips. But Grace was buried in dress fittings and seating charts, exhausted in the particular way brides-to-be become exhausted. The warning slipped between fabrics before it could properly land. After the wedding, Grace promised, almost half listening, "I'll ask him properly after the wedding." It was a promise she wouldn't get the chance to keep before everything changed. By then, the wedding plans had already gathered too much speed to stop safely. Invitations were printed, caterers were booked, neighbors had already started referring to Grace without asking her permission as the new Mrs. Rosewood. Michael proposed publicly at her mother's house in front of neighbors who started clapping before Grace could even process the question. Her mother was already halfway out of her chair before her surgery, tears streaming before Grace had said a single word. Someone had already begun recording on their phone. Someone else was pouring drinks that hadn't been offered yet. Saying no in that moment would have humiliated everyone in the room, including the mother crying with joy just a few feet away. Grace said yes. She told herself quietly that she would find her real answers after the ring was already on her finger, not before. It felt at the time like a small compromise, a small debt she could settle later, once the celebration had died down and the house had emptied of well-wishers. It would not feel that way for very long. The wedding day arrived faster than the fitting of a rushed gown. Rosewood Manor's gates opened to the whole town for the first time in years, guards waving in guests who had only ever seen the estate from the road. There was music enough to fill the hills, food enough to feed 3 villages, and Michael standing at the altar looking for once like a man who had actually let his guard down. Grace walked towards him past rows of familiar faces. Deborah dabbed her eyes in the second row. Her mother beamed from a chair near the front, strong enough now to sit through the whole ceremony without help.
Even Comfort stood near the back in a new head wrap, hands folded, watching the aisle with an expression Grace mistook at the time for pride. For a moment, every warning she had collected over 3 months felt very far away. Then, in the middle of the vows, a woman in the back row stood up. "Sit down, please," the pastor said, raising his voice over the gasps rippling through the pews. "Not until someone answers me," the woman shouted back, wrestling free from a guard's grip, her voice cracking with a grief that silenced the whole courtyard. "Ask him where Patience went," she shouted, pointing straight at Michael. "Ask him what happened to my sister after she married into that house." Guards moved quickly, pulling her out as she kept shouting the same question over and over until her voice faded down the driveway and the gates closed behind her. The crowd murmured, uneasy, glancing at each other instead of the altar. The pastor cleared his throat and continued the ceremony as though nothing had happened at all. Michael's hand, holding Grace's, had gone cold and stiff. "Who is Patience?" Grace whispered. "Not today," Michael said quietly. "Please, not today." She let it go again because the alternative was unthinkable in front of 400 guests who had already started clapping, already reaching for their phones to capture the moment. But the woman's voice followed her all the way to Rosewood Manor that night, louder than the music, louder than her own vows. It followed her up the marble staircase, into a room prepared with rose petals and candlelight that suddenly felt less romantic than watched. It followed her as Michael kissed her forehead and excused himself for an urgent call he promised wouldn't take long. He apologized twice on his way out of the door, as though the apology could undo the timing of it. It followed her as Comfort showed her to the room with her usual warmth, then disappeared down the corridor without another word. And it followed her into the silence that settled over the house the moment his car pulled out of the gate. 30 empty rooms, one new bride, alone with whatever Rosewood Manor had been keeping quiet for longer than 3 months. Which brings this story back to a hallway, a curtain, and a voice telling her not to sleep in that room. Alone in a mansion with 30 rooms, Grace did what curiosity always makes people do. She wandered, her footsteps echoing off marble that never once felt like it belonged to her. She started in the room beside her own, expecting more storage. Instead, she found a wall of wedding portraits, dust settled on every frame, except 3, which had been wiped clean far more recently than the rest. She recognized Michael in each photograph, younger, hopeful, standing beside a different bride every time. 2 of the bride's faces had been carefully cut from their frames, leaving only Michael smiling beside an empty white space where a woman used to stand.
The third photograph still had its bride intact. Grace leaned closer and read the small inscription along the bottom edge, "Sarah and Michael, forever." Her hands were already shaking by the time she reached the next room, a guest bedroom nobody appeared to have slept in years, sheets still folded with hotel corner precision. That was when she heard it. Breathing, slow and careful, coming from behind the heavy curtain at the end of the east hallway, the same door Comfort had specifically called storage. Grace's hand had barely touched the gold handle when a voice stopped her cold. "Grace, listen to me. Don't sleep in that room tonight." She spun around, heart slamming against her ribs. A woman stepped out from behind the curtain, dressed in a wedding gown 3 years too old. Dust settled into every fold of fabric that once clearly had been beautiful. "Who are you?" Grace whispered. "How did you get in here?" "My name is Sarah. I was supposed to be his wife 3 years ago. Nobody has seen me since." For a moment, neither of them said anything else. The house held its breath along with them. Then, somewhere below, a door opened and footsteps started up the stairs, unhurried, patient, the kind of footsteps that had never once needed to rush inside this house. Sarah grabbed Grace's wrist and pulled her deeper into the shadow of the curtain, a finger pressed to her own lips. They stood together in the dark, barely breathing, listening to the footsteps pause at the top of the staircase, hesitate, and move away again,
down the far corridor toward the kitchen wing. "That's Comfort," Sarah whispered, once the silence had settled back over the house. "She checks the halls every night, same time, same route. Most nights I only have a few minutes before she circles back." "You're alive," Grace said, still stunned. "Everyone in this town thinks you left him." "That's exactly what she wanted everyone to think," Sarah said, her voice dropping even lower. "And we don't have long before she checks this hallway again. Come, it's easier to explain if I show you, not just tell you." "Why didn't she just get rid of you completely?" Grace asked, still catching her breath from the near miss in the hallway. "Why keep you hidden instead?" "Money," Sarah said. "Michael's father took land from her family 30 years ago, land that belonged to her brother, and never gave it back. When the old man died and left everything to Michael, Comfort decided she would take it back slowly, piece by piece, wedding by wedding. Every bride brings dowry, gifts, bank transfers for a family blessing nobody questions. Every bride who gets suspicious gets locked away here or paid to vanish somewhere far from Palmgate and threatened into silence." "You didn't leave the moment you realized?" Grace asked. "I tried in the first month," Sarah said, her voice cracking around the memory. "She caught me at the gate, told me if I said one word to anyone, she would tell Micah I had stolen from him and have me arrested before I could explain myself to my own family. They already believe I abandoned my own wedding out of shame. I couldn't bear for them to believe I was a thief as well." "Does Michael know any of this?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "He believes his brides keep leaving because they only wanted his money. Comfort has made certain of that. She intercepts letters. She feeds him just enough bitterness to keep him confused, never curious enough to look closer." Grace's mind raced faster than she could organize it. "Is there proof? Anything that isn't just our word against hers?" Sarah hesitated, then knelt and pulled a small key from underneath a loose floorboard. "Her office. Third door past the kitchen. She keeps a ledger there. Every payment, every bride, every threat, written in her own hand. She's too proud to destroy it. She believes no one else knows it exists." They moved together through the mansion's servants' corridor, the passage built for staff to move unseen between rooms. Floorboards creaked under Grace's weight in a way they never seemed to under Sarah's. The ledger was exactly where Sarah promised it would be, locked inside a drawer that gave way after 3 attempts with the small key. Names, dates, amounts. Patience paid and relocated, silence guaranteed. Sarah contained, awaiting final arrangement. A third name Grace didn't recognize, listed simply as the very first bride, refused to cooperate, handled. "Handled," Grace repeated, her stomach turning over. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Comfort mentions her sometimes when she thinks no one is listening. She says the first one taught her exactly how careful she needed to be with the rest of us." "Who is she?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer. Grace, unwilling to wait, pulled out her phone and began photographing page after page, hands trembling, torn between speed and thoroughness. She had captured only 4 pages when the office door handle began, slowly, to turn. Before Sarah could answer, the door opened and Comfort stood in the frame, no longer wearing the soft, careful expression she had used with Grace for weeks. Her face was calm in a way that felt far more dangerous than anger. "You found my book," she said. "I always wondered which of you would be brave enough or foolish enough. You've been stealing from this family for years, ruining lives to do it." "I'm taking back what was stolen from mine," Comfort said, stepping fully inside and closing the door behind her. His father took our land, our name, our future, and this whole town called him generous for it. I decided his son would pay every bride's price for that generosity, one wedding at a time. That's not justice, that's revenge wearing a nicer name. Call it whatever helps you sleep. Neither of you is leaving this room with that book. She lunged for it, catching the edge of the cover before Grace wrenched it free and held it against her chest like a shield. Give me the ledger, and I'll let you both walk out with a generous settlement. Comfort straightened her blouse, composure sliding back into place like a mask returning to its hook. Fight me, and I'll make sure the police find enough evidence to believe you stole from this house instead. Nobody will believe that, Sarah said. They believed I was a devoted housekeeper for 30 years. People believe whatever the powerful decide to tell them. Sarah pulled Grace toward the servant's door, but Comfort reached it first, an old iron key already turning in the lock. Grace's phone buzzed once. A message from Deborah. You've been silent all evening. Call me or I'm coming there myself. Comfort snatched the phone away before Grace could answer, dropping it into a drawer with a click that echoed louder than it should have.
What Comfort didn't know was that Deborah never made empty threats either. She was already standing at the gates of Rosewood Manor, refusing to leave without seeing Grace herself. A guard who had spent 3 years quietly wondering about a locked door and untouched trays of food finally decided this wasn't his business to ignore any longer. He called Michael before Deborah even finished her sentence. Michael was back in 11 minutes, breaking every limit between the meeting hall and the gate. Deborah was close behind him in her own car. Inside the locked office, Comfort reached for his small vial in her drawer, the same one Grace suspected had kept Sarah calm for 3 long years. Drink this, Comfort said, gently now, almost coaxing. It will make tonight easier for both of us. No, Grace said, stepping in front of Sarah without thinking twice. You are in no position to make demands. Comfort said. Neither are you, said a voice from the doorway. Michael stood there, chest heaving, eyes moving from the vial to Sarah's face, a woman he had spent 3 years believing had simply abandoned him. Sarah, he said, her name barely making it past his throat. For half a second, Comfort's eyes flicked toward the servant's door, calculating whether she could still disappear the way she had made 3 other women disappear. The guard behind Michael stepped sideways, quietly closing off that option before she could try. Explain all of it right now. The vial slipped from Comfort's fingers and shattered against the marble floor, and with it, so the 30 years of a story she had built, one careful lie at a time. The truth came out in pieces over the following hour, then in full over the following days, once police arrived and the ledger was entered into evidence. Comfort's brother had indeed lost family land to Michael's father in a deal that had never been fully honest. Comfort had spent 30 years working her way into the household, not out of loyalty, but patience. She was waiting for the moment she could take back, quietly and completely, everything she believed her family was owed. When police finally led her out through the same gates she had guarded for 3 decades, Comfort didn't struggle and didn't apologize. Ask your father's ghost why this was necessary, she told Michael, voice steady even in handcuffs. I only finished what he started. Michael had no answer to a ghost. He only had the living people left in front of him to take care of. 2 weeks into the investigation, the ledger's last unanswered thread finally led somewhere good. Patience was found alive in a town 6 hours away, working under a name that wasn't her own, too afraid of Comfort's threats to ever come home.
When her sister's phone rang with her voice on the other end for the first time in 3 years, the whole street outside their house could hear her crying with relief. Patience's testimony alongside Sarah's and the ledger itself was enough to keep Comfort behind bars long before her trial date arrived. Michael sat outside the manor gate that night, unable to step back inside the house he had called home his entire life. Grace sat beside him, saying nothing for a long while, because some silences don't need filling. I built my whole life around being generous enough to make up for what my father did, Michael finally said. I never imagined he'd already started a war I didn't know I was fighting. You are not responsible for his choices, Grace said, but you are responsible for what you do now that you know the truth. I don't know how to fix 30 years of someone else's damage. You don't fix it alone, Grace said. You start with the people still standing in front of you, and you don't look away this time. It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't need to be. He nodded once, and for the first time all night, some of the weight left his shoulders. Sarah was reunited with her family within the week, the shame she had carried for 3 years replaced slowly by the relief of finally being believed. Her mother met her at the door before she could even knock, pulling her into an embrace that lasted long enough to make up for 3 years of silence. We searched everywhere, her mother said. We never stopped believing you were still trying to find your way home. I found it, Sarah said. It just took longer than anyone should have to wait. Grace didn't move into Rosewood Manor that week or the week after. She went back to her small shop, her jammed sewing machine, and her mother's recovering health, needing space to decide what she actually wanted, separate from gratitude, separate from rescue. Michael didn't sell Rosewood Manor, but he changed it beyond recognition. The East Wing, where Sarah had once been hidden, became a small support center for women recovering from exploitation and family land disputes, staffed by people Comfort would never have approved of hiring. It wasn't an apology big enough to undo 3 ruined engagements. It was, at least, a beginning. Before we get to how this story ends, a quick word. If you've stayed with Grace this far, this is the perfect moment to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment and tell me which part of tonight's story surprised you the most. Michael came to find Grace 3 weeks later, standing outside her shop the same way he had the very first day, except this time without guards, without the car, without the version of himself built entirely from other people's expectations. I'm not asking you to move into a mansion, he said. I'm asking if you'd let me start over properly this time, as 2 people who actually know each other. That depends, Grace said, allowing herself a small smile for the first time in weeks. Do you still not ask people's names before you drop fabric on their table? I remember your name perfectly, Michael said. Grace, the only person who ever argued with me about fabric prices instead of asking to see my house. Deborah, watching from across the street with her arms crossed, finally let herself grin. Took you too long enough. Grace's mother, still gaining her strength back 1 week at a time, held both of Grace's hands the night she agreed to give Michael a real chance. I didn't want you to marry a mansion, she said. I only ever wanted you to marry a man who tells you the truth, even when it costs him. For the first time since the wedding day chaos, that finally felt possible. Michael and Grace didn't rush back into wedding plans. They spent the following months learning each other properly, arguing over small things the way ordinary couples do, without a mansion shadow deciding how fast trust should grow. The wedding, when it finally happened again months later, was smaller. No 30-room mansion, no 400 guests, just family, real friends, and a house Michael had chosen specifically because it had never belonged to anyone with a hidden ledger. Every woman in Palmgate still talked about Rosewood Michael, but the story had changed. It wasn't about the mansion anymore. It was about the ordinary tailor who refused to accept a fairy tale until she knew it was true. Even the old man selling roasted corn near the church updated his story now, turning the corn a little slower than before. That land wasn't cursed, he told his customers now, turning the corn a little slower than before. It was just waiting for someone honest enough to dig up what was buried instead of building another wall over it. Grace never corrected him. Some truths travel further, wrapped in the stories people already know how to tell. Because, in the end, dreams built on secrets always demand a price from someone. The real question was never how big the house looked from the outside. It was what Grace was willing to uncover before she agreed to spend her first night inside it.